Okay, so get this. One study found that 80%, get this, 80% of writers at the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop had experienced a mood disorder. Wow. That's wild, right? Like, it really makes you think. Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, the show where we dig into the age-old question, is there a connection between creativity and mental illness?
It's a question that has fascinated people forever, it seems like. And today, we're going to really dive deep. We're looking at this book, Creativity and Illness, edited by James C. Kaufman.
And we're not messing around with this book. This book is like the all-star team of experts.
Oh, yeah.
We've got psychologists, psychiatrists, researchers. There's even a jazz critic and musician.
It's a really incredible collection.
I know. I'm really excited to get into it. So where should we even begin with all this?
Well, one thing that I think is really fascinating is all the different ways they look at this question. We're talking history, neuroscience, evolutionary theory.
Okay, so like the whole shebang. It's like they're saying, hey, this is a big question.
Yeah.
We need to look at it from all sides.
And they really do.
So for our listeners who maybe haven't really thought about this before, what's the deal with this whole mad genius thing? Where'd that come from?
Well, the idea that creativity and mental illness are like connected somehow, you know, it goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they believed in divine madness, which sounds pretty intense.
Divine madness.
Yeah, like the idea was that creative inspiration came straight from the gods.
Okay.
And it would come through these like super intense, like almost frenzied states.
So like oracles having visions,
Exactly.
prophets getting divine messages, poets being all inspired by the muses and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It was like having a little bit of madness was the key to being creative.
Like a secret ingredient.
Right. And this fascination with the tortured artist, you know, it kept going through history. The Romantic era, they really loved that image.
Oh, yeah, those classic paintings of like brooding artists, right?
Yes, totally.
Like lost in their own little world.
Yeah.
Maybe a little sad looking.
It's like suffering for your art made you a better artist.
Like a badge of honor.
Yeah. And it stuck with us, you know. We're still drawn to that image.
So we've talked about the history and like the image of the tortured artist. But what about now? What does science actually say about this?
Okay, well, researchers have been trying to figure that out for a long time. They've used all sorts of methods.
What kind of methods?
Well, one approach is called historiometric studies.
Historiometric studies. That sounds fancy.
It is kind of fancy. Basically, they take a bunch of famous people from history,
Okay.
and they analyze their biographies looking for, like, patterns and connections between their creative output and their mental health.
Those are like detectives.
Yeah, sort of.
They're digging through all the historical records, diaries, letters, maybe even medical records.
Yeah.
Trying to see if there's any truth to that whole tortured artist stereotype.
Right. And, you know, they found some interesting stuff. Like one study found that political leaders and composers tended to be pretty mentally healthy.
Really?
Yeah. But imaginative writers, those guys had a much higher rate of mental illness.
So you're telling me politicians are more well-adjusted than writers?
It seems that way. Yeah.
Huh. That's kind of surprising.
It is. It shows you how complicated this all is.
For sure.
There was another historiometric study that looked at suicide rates.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out that literary figures were twice as likely to attempt or commit suicide compared to people in other fields.
Wow. That's really sad.
It is. It makes you wonder what's going on there.
Yeah, like are there certain pressures that come with being a writer that other professions don't have?
Right, and it shows we need to keep researching this.
Definitely.
But, you know, we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. Just because there's a link between being creative and having a mental illness, it doesn't mean one causes the other.
Right. There could be tons of other factors at play.
And that's where other research methods come in.
Like what?
Well, case studies, for example.
Huh?
Those give you a much more in-depth look at individual experiences.
So instead of just looking at the big picture, we're zooming in on one person's life.
Right, and that can help us understand all the different factors that might be involved in both creativity and mental illness.
Are there any case studies from the book that really stood out to you?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
There's one about Virginia Woolf.
Oh, wow. She's like the classic mad genius. Right?
Totally. Her writing was amazing, so innovative, so personal.
Yeah.
But she struggled with bipolar disorder her whole life.
And she ended up taking her own life.
She did, yeah.
It's a reminder that mental illness is really complex,
Yeah.
and it can look different for everyone.
Yeah, and that's where this concept of schizotypy comes in.
Schizotypy.
Yeah, it's a personality trait that has some things in common with schizophrenia, but not as severe.
So like someone with schizotypy might have unusual thoughts or perceptions,
Exactly.
but it doesn't like interfere with their daily life.
Right. And some research shows there might be a connection between schizotypy and creativity. Yeah, especially with divergent thinking. That's the ability to come up with lots of different ideas or solutions.
Interesting. So maybe those unusual ways of thinking can actually be helpful for creativity.
It's possible. It's like they see the world differently, and that can lead to new ideas.
Like having a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's connected to this other thing called latent inhibition.
Latent inhibition. What's that?
Basically, it's how well your brain filters out information that's not important.
Oh, like a mental spam filter.
Exactly. And studies have shown that people with schizophrenia often have lower latent inhibition, so they're taking in more information from their surroundings.
So their brains are working overtime.
You could say that, yeah. And it can be overwhelming for sure, but it can also lead to them making connections that other people wouldn't.
Because they're seeing all these different pieces of the puzzle.
Right. And it makes you wonder if there's a sweet spot, you know?
Like a balance between being open to everything and being able to focus.
Right. Too much of either could be a bad thing.
So where does neuroscience fit into all of this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Researchers are using all these new brain imaging techniques to try to understand what's happening in the brain when we're being creative and when we're experiencing mental illness.
So are there like specific parts of the brain that are involved in both?
Well, one area they're really interested in is the prefrontal cortex.
Oh yeah, we talked about that before.
Right. It's like the CEO of the brain. It helps us plan, make decisions, and control our impulses.
Right.
And some studies show that people with certain mental illnesses, like bipolar disorder, might have some differences in how their prefrontal cortex works.
Interesting.
Yeah, and these differences might actually be linked to creativity, too, like the ability to think outside the box.
So the same part of the brain that's involved in mental illness could also be involved in creative breakthroughs.
It's possible. It really shows how complex this all is. And then there's the whole world of neurotransmitters.
Oh yeah, those are the chemical messengers in the brain, right?
Exactly. And one that they've been studying a lot is dopamine.
Dopamine, that's the feel-good chemical.
Yeah. It's involved in reward motivation, pleasure, all that good stuff.
Okay.
And some research suggests that people with bipolar disorder might have problems with their dopamine system.
Which would explain the extreme highs and lows.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Dopamine is also thought to play a role in creativity.
Really?
Yeah. Some studies show that when dopamine is more active, people are better at coming up with new ideas.
So that same dopamine rush that might be fueling a manic episode could also be what's behind those bursts of creative energy.
It's pretty wild, right?
It is. It's like this one chemical is involved in both the good and the bad.
Yeah. We still need to do more research to really understand all the nuances, but it's clear that there's something going on there.
Okay, so we've talked about the brain, but it's not just about biology, right? Personality probably plays a role too.
Oh, definitely. There are certain personality traits that seem to be linked to both creativity and mental illness, like openness to experience.
Openness to experience. So like people who are curious and imaginative.
Exactly. They're always trying new things, exploring new ideas. They're drawn to novelty and complexity.
They're like the adventurers of the personality world.
I like that. And this openness can be amazing for creativity. It lets them see the world in new ways and come up with original ideas.
But it can also make them more sensitive.
Right. They
Yeah.
might be more easily overwhelmed or stressed.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. And it just shows how important context is.
What do you mean?
Well, the same personality trait can be good or bad depending on the situation. The person's environment, their coping skills, all that stuff matters.
So it's not just about who you are, it's about where you are and what you're dealing with.
Exactly. And speaking of personality traits, another big one is impulsivity.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
acting without thinking, jumping into things head first.
Right. And that can obviously be risky, but it can also be a source of spontaneity and creativity.
Like sometimes you have to break the rules to make something truly original.
Totally. And some research suggests that people with bipolar disorder might be more impulsive, especially during manic episodes.
When their energy is super high and they're not really thinking straight.
Right. So again, it's that double-edged sword. The same thing that can lead to amazing creative output can also lead to destructive behavior.
So how do we help people find that balance?
Well, I think awareness is key. Helping people recognize those impulsive tendencies and learning to manage them.
Like maybe through therapy or mindfulness practices?
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between letting go and staying in control.
So we've got openness to experience and impulsivity. What other personality traits are we talking about here?
Well, another one is sensitivity.
Sensitivity. So like being really in tune with your own emotions and the emotions of others.
Yeah, they're like emotional sponges. They pick up on everything.
And that can be a beautiful thing, but it can also be really overwhelming,
Exactly. It's like they're feeling everything so intensely.
especially for artists and writers who are drawing on their own emotions for their work.
Right. They're constantly living in that emotional space.
So it's like they need to find ways to protect themselves from burnout.
Exactly. Things like self-care, mindfulness, spending time in nature, all that stuff is super important.
Okay, so we've got impulsivity, sensitivity. What else?
Well, how about perfectionism?
Oh yeah, that one's a killer.
Yeah.
Always striving for flawlessness, never feeling like anything is good enough
Right. And it can really get in the way of creativity. It can lead to procrastination and self-doubt.
because you're so afraid of making a mistake.
And research suggests that perfectionism might be more common in people with certain mental illnesses, like anxiety disorders.
Which makes sense. Perfectionism is often driven by fear.
Exactly. Fear of failure, fear of judgment. And that can be amplified when you're already struggling with mental health.
So how do we help people who are stuck in that perfectionist trap?
Well, I think the first step is helping them become aware of it, recognizing that inner critic that's always telling them they're not good enough.
And then learning to challenge those thoughts.
Right. And shifting their focus from the outcome to the process.
Enjoying the journey instead of obsessing over the destination.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between striving for excellence and accepting that good enough is sometimes good enough.
Okay, so we've talked about impulsivity, sensitivity, perfectionism. Are there any other personality traits that are important in this whole creativity, mental illness thing?
Well, one that I think is interesting is introversion.
Introversion. So like people who need time alone to recharge.
Right. And it's important to remember that introversion is not a mental illness.
Right, it's just a personality trait.
Exactly. But there's this idea out there that you have to be outgoing and extroverted to be creative.
Oh yeah, that's totally not true.
Right. In fact, there's some research suggesting that introverts might actually have some creative advantages.
Really?
Yeah, because creativity often requires solitude, reflection, and deep focus. And those are all things that introverts are really good at.
It's like they're able to tune out the noise of the world and tap into their own inner world.
Exactly. And they're often more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, which can be really helpful in the creative process.
So instead of seeing introversion as a weakness, it's actually a strength.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of diversity in creative fields. We need all kinds of minds to make truly innovative work.
It's like a garden. The more diverse the plants, the healthier the ecosystem.
I love that analogy. And it's a reminder that we should be celebrating our differences and recognizing the unique contributions that each personality type brings to the table.
This has been a fascinating look at how personality can influence both creativity and mental health. But before we wrap up this part of the discussion, I want to touch on another important factor: culture.
Ah, yes, culture. It shapes everything, doesn't it?
It really does. So how does culture impact the way we view both creativity and mental illness?
Well, for starters, different cultures have different attitudes towards mental illness. Some cultures are more accepting and supportive.
While others might see it as a sign of weakness or something to be ashamed of,
Exactly. And those attitudes can have a huge impact on how people experience mental illness and how they seek help.
it's like some cultures provide a safety net, while others leave people feeling isolated and alone.
And it's not just about mental illness. Culture also shapes our understanding of what it means to be creative.
Oh yeah, for sure. What's considered creative in one culture might be seen as weird or even offensive in another.
Exactly. And that can make it really tough for creative people who are trying to find their own voice.
Especially if they feel pressure to conform to what's expected of them.
Right. It can stifle their creativity and lead to a lot of inner conflict.
So it sounds like creating a supportive environment is key. A place where people feel safe to express themselves without judgment.
Absolutely. And that means challenging those negative stereotypes and promoting open-mindedness.
And recognizing that creativity can be a powerful tool for healing and growth.
Well said.
This has been a really great start to our exploration of creativity and illness. We've covered so much ground already, from the history of the mad genius to the role of personality and culture.
And we're just getting started. There's still so much more to discuss.
Definitely. So stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive.
We'll be exploring even more fascinating insights from the book and diving deeper into the world of the creative mind.
We'll be back in a flash.
Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Before the break, we were talking about how culture shapes our views on creativity and mental illness, and how important it is to make space for different ways of expressing yourself.
Yeah, like we need to build a place where all those creative minds can really thrive, no matter what their background is or how their brain works.
I like that a lot. And speaking of how brains work, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty,
Ooh, yeah.
the cognitive neuroscience research. It's really shedding light on the connection between creativity and mental illness, you know?
Let's do it. I'm ready to get neuro-nerdy.
All right, so what happens in the brain when someone has like a stroke of genius?
Right.
Well, it's not like there's a single creativity button in there.
Yeah, okay.
It's way more about how all these different parts of the brain work together, the networks and chemicals.
Okay, so it's more like an orchestra with all these different sections playing their part to make the music.
Exactly. And one of the most important players in this orchestra is the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, yeah, the CEO of the brain.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It's in charge of planning, making decisions, controlling impulses, all that.
Right.
And some studies suggest that folks with certain mental illnesses, like bipolar disorder, might have some differences in how their prefrontal cortex works.
Interesting.
Yeah, especially in areas that control emotions and impulses.
So maybe their conductor's a little more relaxed.
Right.
Maybe allows for more improvisation, a little bit more freedom.
Exactly. And that can be tricky, because it can lead to some of the challenges that come with mental illness.
Yeah.
But it might also make them more open to new ideas and different ways of doing things.
Right, because sometimes you got to break the rules to make something truly new.
That's it. And it actually connects to this idea of latent inhibition.
Latent inhibition. Remind me what that is again?
It's basically the brain's spam filter, how well it blocks out information that's not important.
Oh, yeah.
And studies have shown that people with schizophrenia often have trouble with this. Their filter isn't as strong.
So their brains are taking in way more information than the average person.
Right, and that can be totally overwhelming.
I bet.
But it can also help them make connections that other people wouldn't see.
Because they're looking at everything.
Exactly. It's like seeing the world through a kaleidoscope. All these different pieces of information swirling around, creating these crazy patterns.
Oh, like that.
Yeah. And this ties into divergent thinking, the ability to come up with a ton of different ideas or solutions.
Right. Right.
So people with lower latent inhibition, they might be better at this because they're considering all these possibilities.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. It's like they're not afraid to wander off the beaten path, to explore uncharted territory.
And that's where the real magic happens, right?
Exactly. You got to be willing to embrace the unknown if you want to make something truly groundbreaking.
So you're saying there's a sweet spot for latent inhibition.
That's what it seems like, yeah. Too much filtering and you miss out on those cool connections.
Yeah.
Too little and you just get lost in all the noise.
Okay, so we've got the prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
the spam filter.
Yeah.
What else is going on in this creative orchestra?
Well, there are also these chemical messengers in the brain called neurotransmitters.
Oh, yeah, right. The brain's communication system.
Exactly. And one that's super important for both creativity and mental illness is dopamine.
Dopamine. That's the one that makes us feel good, right?
Yeah, it's involved in reward, motivation, pleasure, all that fun stuff.
Okay.
And it also helps us focus and learn.
Interesting.
Yeah. And some research suggests that folks with bipolar disorder might have problems with how their dopamine system is working.
Which would explain why they have such intense highs and lows.
Right. It's like their dopamine is on a roller coaster.
Up and down, up and down.
And get this, dopamine is also thought to play a role in creativity.
Really? So that same chemical that's involved in these intense mood swings might also be what's fueling creative inspiration?
It seems that way. It's like a two-sided coin.
Heads, you get a burst of creative energy. Tails, you get a mood swing.
It's wild, right? We definitely need more research to fully understand it all.
Okay, so we've got the prefrontal cortex, latent inhibition, dopamine. What other instruments are in this brain orchestra?
Well, the temporal lobe is another important one.
The temporal lobe, what's that one do?
It's all about language memory hearing, and it's thought to be involved in making metaphors and analogies.
Oh, so it's like the poet of the brain.
I like that. Weaving together words and images to make something new. And then you've got the hippocampus.
The hippocampus?
Yeah, it's essential for making new memories and navigating space.
Okay.
And it's thought to play a role in imagination and the ability to picture things in your mind.
So like the architect of the brain, building mental models and coming up with new designs.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the amygdala.
The amygdala, that's the emotion center, right?
That's the one. It's all about processing feelings, especially fear and anxiety. And even though we often think of creativity as this purely mental thing, emotions actually play a huge role.
So the amygdala is like the heart of the creative process, giving our ideas passion and intensity.
Beautifully said. And all of these brain regions are connected. They're constantly talking to each other through this huge network of pathways.
Wow, it's amazing how it all works together.
It really is, and we're only just beginning to understand it.
So what about genetics? Is there like a creativity gene that some people are born with?
You know, it would be nice if it was that simple.
Right.
But creativity is way too complex for that. It's a mix of genes and environment, nature and nurture.
So it's like you inherit a set of tools,
Yeah.
but you still have to learn how to use them.
Exactly. And the environment plays a huge role. Things like your childhood experiences, whether you were exposed to art education, all that stuff shapes your creative potential.
It's like you're given a canvas and some paint, but you also need someone to teach you how to paint and a place to do it.
I like that a lot. And it shows how important it is to nurture creativity in kids, Give them the tools and support they need to thrive.
Now, I know we've been focusing on the positive side of this connection between creativity and mental illness,
Right.
but I think it's important to acknowledge that there can be downsides too.
Absolutely. We can't romanticize mental illness or act like it's a good thing. It can be incredibly painful and debilitating.
And we definitely don't want to create this idea that you had to be a little bit crazy to be creative.
Right. It's not about glorifying mental illness. It's about understanding the whole spectrum of human experience and recognizing that both creativity and mental illness are part of that.
So we need to be sensitive and nuanced in how we talk about this.
For sure. It's about fostering compassion and support, creating a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help if they need it.
And where creativity is celebrated and nurtured.
Exactly, because creativity can be a powerful force for healing and growth, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
And that brings us back to art therapy.
Yes, art therapy. Such a powerful tool.
Can you tell us a little more about how it works? Like, how can it help people who are struggling with mental health?
Sure. So art therapy uses the process of making art to help people feel better emotionally and mentally.
So it's not just about making pretty pictures. It's about using art to communicate and work through difficult emotions.
Exactly. And it's not limited to just painting or drawing. You can use sculpture, music, drama, dance, writing, anything that gets those creative juices flowing.
Like a buffet of creative expression.
I love that. And you know what? It's not just for people with mental illness either.
Right.
No, anyone can benefit from it. If you're looking to explore your emotions, express yourself, grow as a person, art therapy can be a great tool.
It's like exercise for your soul.
I like that a lot.
So what about people who say, oh, I'm not an artist. I can't even draw a stick figure.
I hear that all the time. But here's the thing. Art therapy is not about being good at art. It's about the process of creating, not the final product.
It's about letting go of those judgments and expectations and just letting yourself play.
Exactly. And the alt therapist is there to guide you through that process, to help you make sense of what comes up.
So they're like a creative coach.
You could say that. They provide a safe space for you to explore, and they help you connect your art to your emotions and experiences.
That sounds really powerful.
It is, and it's gaining more and more recognition as people are realizing how transformative art can be.
Well, this has been an incredible exploration of the healing power of art. But I think we need to take a short break to let everything sink in.
Sounds good. We'll be back soon with the final part of our discussion, where we'll explore even more ideas from creativity and illness.
Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we? Exploring this whole idea of creativity and mental illness.
Yeah, it's definitely more complicated than I think a lot of people realize.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's not just a simple case of, oh, you're creative, so you must be a little crazy, or you have a mental illness, so you must be a genius.
Right. It's way more nuanced than that.
And one of the things that really comes through in this book is the importance of context.
Right. Yeah, context. So, like, what kind of environmental factors can influence how creativity and mental illness play out?
Well, one of the biggest ones is culture. Different cultures have totally different views on mental illness.
Right.
They have different ways of expressing creativity, and they have different levels of support for artists and innovators.
So, like, a culture that's all about tradition and following the rules might not be so welcoming to someone who's thinking outside the box.
Exactly. And if a culture has a lot of stigma around mental illness, it can be really hard for people to get help or to express themselves freely through their art.
It's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right. They're supposed to be creative and original, but they're also supposed to fit in and not make waves.
And that can create so much stress and conflict.
Which can really take a toll on both their mental health and their creativity.
So it sounds like having a supportive environment is crucial.
It's everything. It means challenging those negative stereotypes, promoting open-mindedness, and making sure there are resources available for people who are struggling.
It's about creating spaces where people feel safe to be themselves, to take risks, and to explore their unique perspectives.
And to recognize that creativity can be a powerful force for healing and growth, both for individuals and for the world as a whole.
That reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with art therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Can you say a little more about that? Like, how does art therapy actually help people with mental health challenges?
Well, it gives people a way to express and process their emotions, especially the ones that are hard to put into words.
So art becomes a way to communicate those feelings that are trapped inside.
Exactly. And through that creative process, people can start to understand themselves better, their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors,
Right.
and they can learn new ways to cope with their challenges.
So it's not just about venting, it's about actually growing and healing.
Exactly. And art therapy can be used for so many different things.
Like what?
Well, it can help with trauma and grief, anxiety and depression. It can be used with kids and adults.
So it's really adaptable.
It is. And you don't have to be a real artist to benefit from it.
Right. Because it's not about the final product, it's about the process.
Exactly. It's about giving yourself permission to experiment, to play, to just let go and be creative.
Without judgment or self-criticism.
Right. And I think that's a really important message for everyone. We all have that creative spark inside of us,
Whether we realize it or not.
and we can all benefit from tapping into it, whether it's through painting or writing or dancing or just spending time in nature, appreciating the beauty around us.
Creativity can bring us joy, healing, and connection. It can help us make sense of the world and find our place in it.
And it can be a real source of strength when times get tough.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into creativity and illness. It's been an amazing conversation.
I agree.
We've explored so many fascinating ideas about the connection between these two seemingly different worlds.
From the history of the mad genius to the latest brain research. And we've seen how creativity can be a powerful tool for healing and growth.
We hope this discussion has inspired you to think differently about creativity and mental illness,
And to embrace your own creative potential.
no matter what form it takes.
So go out there, explore, experiment, and let your creativity shine.
And if you're struggling, don't be afraid to reach out for help.
There are people who care and resources available to support you. You don't have to go through it alone.
Thanks for joining us on the Mad Genius Thesis. Keep those creative fires burning.